Black Eye Perspective.
Four years after Arkansas executed Ledell Lee, DNA points to someone else. On April 20th, 2017, Ledell Lee was executed by the state of Arkansas for murder, with insisting to the end that he was innocent of a crime. A new DNA evidence test in the case shows that he was absolutely innocent. A new DNA test of evidence in the case, which the state refused to do before executing him, points to a different suspect than Lee. Lee was put to death 4 years ago as a part of a rush in which Arkansas tried to execute many people, 8 people, in 11 days, so that the state could use scarce lethal injection drugs before they expired. Wow. That mad dash had 4 men executed. 3 had their executions stayed, and 1 was granted clemency. Lee was one of the 4th to be put to death after Neil Gorsuch, in his first vote as a member of the Supreme Court, joined a 5-4 ruling to allow the execution to proceed. Even then, Lee's case was considered one of the most seriously flawed, with a distinct chance that the state would be putting an innocent man to death. That decision to allow the execution to go forward is looking worse and worse. Last week, the ACLU and the Innocence Project released the results of a DNA testing that was requested prior to Lee's execution, but was only permitted to go ahead after a lawsuit was filed by Lee's sister last year. Those results demonstrated that another man's DNA was found on the murder weapon, a wooden club, and on a shirt that had been wrapped around the murder weapon. The unknown man's DNA, however, was not found in the FBI's National Criminal Database. 5 sets of fingerprints found at the scene of the crime did not belong to Lee, and they were also entered into the national database, but yet yielded no results. The Arkansas State Crime Laboratory has yet to test those fingerprints against its own database. 6 hairs from the scene were also tested, and Lee was excluded as the source of the 5, but could not be excluded as the source of the 6th. Though such mitochondrial DNA profiles may be shared by thousands of individuals in a given population, the Innocence Project noted. The reason the mitochondrial DNA profiles aren't unique and may be common to thousands of people in a community, that is, they share by everyone in a common maternal line, even very distant cousins across different generations. A representative from the ACLU said, and continued, in small communities or ones where many residents may have some common ancestry, 2 people may share an identical mitochondrial DNA profile, even if they have no idea that they are distantly related. So, while mitochondrial DNA can be used to exclude someone as a potential source of a hair, or to narrow down a pool of potential candidates, it can't be used to positively identify the source. Quote, while this phase of litigation and court-ordered DNA testing is now concluded and the investigation in the case remains open due to the possibility of a future database hit to the unknown male DNA or unknown fingerprints from the crime scene. Nina Morrison, the senior litigation counsel at the Innocence Project, said in a statement last week. She continues, "We are hopeful that one or more of these forensic law enforcement databases will generate additional information in the future," end quote. The case now appears to be in limbo, but the murder weapon, DNA from a man who is not Ledell Lee, adds to one of the many, many flaws in the case against him, as they wrote last year. Now, Lee's first trial ended in a hung jury. At the second one, his lawyers did not bring up some of the potentially exonerating testimony and evidence raised in the first case, including an alibi testimony from Lee's family members. And in the second trial, a jury of 11 white Arkansas and one black Arkansan in a county where nearly one-third of its residents were black found him guilty after a 4-day trial and 3 hours of deliberation. The conviction came 1 week after a racially charged O.J. Simpson verdict, and one witness alluded to the verdict by recalling a conversation she had, saying, quote, "Last week when they let O.J. Simpson go," end quote. Lee's case also relied heavily on a shoe pattern, forensics evidence that was later demonstrated to also have been heavily flawed. The flaws in the case continued through the appellate process. Lee's initial appellate attorney appeared drunk in court and later acknowledged that he had substance abuse problems. More importantly, he never introduced evidence that Lee was intellectually disabled and never won testing on DNA samples that now point to the likelihood of a different suspect. Earlier this week, Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson insisted that he did his duty to carry out the law following the Supreme Court's ruling in 2017. Arkansas Attorney General Leslie Rutledge, meanwhile, dismissed the DNA evidence and still insisted that Lee had committed the 1993 murder of Deborah Reese, for which he was executed. The sad fact is that Arkansas should not have executed Lee, and further evidence indicates that another man may have committed the crime. Yet, Lee's family still must wait for a definitive proof of another suspect, and it may never come. Either way, advocates for continuation of the death penalty should have contend. They should have to, with this nightmarish fact that Lee's case, as long as folks are being executed in the United States, will clearly go without justice. This is Felicia Lockhart, and this has been the Lockhart News Brief. As we listen to the story that I just read, you would have to wonder exactly where we're headed in America. Well, we hear all the time of how we've made so many different strides to prevent ourselves from being that wretched country that we have all had to try to sweep up after. But when you hear of stories like this, it really breaks your heart. It actually saddens you, and it wouldn't matter what color the person was. That's the sweet part about Americans, is that we can see past that. However, when you look at this situation and you look at the jurors and you look at the fact that only one was black in an entire county that had the preponderance of its residents as black individuals, you can only see that there is some writing on the wall that tells you we have a long way to go as a society. Not necessarily just as black people or just as white people, but as a whole. It's amazing that in a country that's the alleged superpower, or at least it once was, would have to have these type of issues continue. Well, the sad part is that there's so few of us that even hear of some of these stories. And other stories that show a little bit more interest are the ones that are sketchy at best. This story is one that tells us that we have some deep problems that need to be uprooted. Uprooted because it makes all of us look bad. It stinks to high heaven when you hear of somebody's child actually saying they were innocent and later being killed for the exact same thing that they have protested. Now, here's the sad part. The governor had the gall to stand and say that he still feels that justice was served, even in the face of evidence that shows contrary to what was said at that time. I believe that even though this gentleman had one particular attorney and then another, the fact that this one gentleman who was his attorney came in drunk should have told people that that person was not the one to take care of this man's case, and it should have been tossed out then. I wonder why they didn't look at the evidence. I wonder why they didn't look at the fact that he did have an alibi. I wonder what was going through the mind of those individuals as they concocted this story. Because as you look at the evidence that was set before them, even the evidence beyond the fact of the actual murder weapon having someone else's DNA on it, you would have to say that there was a concerted effort to withhold truth, and that the life of this human being was hanging in the balance. And now we understand that 4 years later, he has been murdered. This is exactly what happened to this young man. His family will never see him again. God rest his soul. If his mother's alive, she will never see him again. It's a case of, oh well, oops. That's exactly what this is. It's a case of, oh well, oops. We didn't mean any harm. You win some, you lose some. We just made a mistake. Here's the young man's face. There he is. How about looking at him and thinking about the fact that if it weren't for the grace of God, it could be you, it could be me, it could be my son, it could be one of my grandsons, it could be a brother, it could be a relative, it could be a co-worker. One thing I like about the Lockhart perspective is that we have such an eclectic group of co-laborers, people that work here in our local neighborhoods, here where I stay, and then we have people all over the United States and the world. And this kind of situation with the eclectic group of individuals that frequent this channel would make all of us angry. Again, it doesn't matter the shade, but it does beg the question, why didn't anybody care? And yes, it is indicative of the things that do go on in Black communities where there are no cameras. There are no cameras. Nobody brings a camera around. Nobody starts to poll the neighborhood and vet information that people are talking about or saying, hey, I was innocent, or hey, he was with me that weekend. Nobody presses the issue. No one. It just goes away as an oops. God help us all.
Black God perspective.